Breaking, Joe Biden drops out. Now, many people felt that the stakes of the 2024 election were high and that Joe Biden was not the best candidate to defeat Donald Trump. So with the election a little over 3 months away, some Democrats urged Biden to drop out while others thought it would be political suicide. But now that Biden has dropped out, it raises a ton of thorny legal questions. Is it legal for delegates to vote for somebody else? Can Republicans challenge it in court? Can Democrats meet the state ballot deadlines? And what happens to all those campaign funds? Now, earlier this year, Joe Biden and Donald Trump won their respective primaries, making them the party's presumptive nominees. But they only become official nominees at the party conventions. Just 40 years ago, the system was different. Republicans and Democrats held primaries or caucuses, but the results were advisory and the nominees were determined behind closed doors or at party conventions. Now the situation is reversed. The primaries determine who wins the presidential nomination, and the conventions are largely commercials for the winning candidates. The Republican convention took place in mid-July, and the Democratic National Convention is coming up, as of the time of this video, in August. But it's not unprecedented for a president to face a challenger at the convention. In 1980, Jimmy Carter was deeply unpopular with the American people, so Senator Ted Kennedy tried to get Carter's delegates to vote for him. The effort failed, and Carter got curb-stomped by Ronald Reagan in the general election. And the last time the Democrats held a convention in Chicago in 1968, it was a disaster. Lyndon B. Johnson was pressured to exit the race because of dissatisfaction over the Vietnam War, and as Vice President Hubert Humphrey didn't compete in the primaries, but he inherited the delegates that had been pledged to Johnson. Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated months earlier on June 5, 1968, but at the time of the convention in August, he had still amassed 393 delegates. Humphrey had 561, and Eugene McCarthy had 258. The resulting convention was a mess, with states trying to seat competing slates of delegates, protesters clashing with police, and intense debates about the Vietnam War. Eventually, Humphrey was nominated and lost to Richard Nixon in the general election, and you can check out my video about the trial of the Chicago 7, a movie about the 8 activists arrested during the 68 convention. So let's say that Biden decides to release his delegates at the convention, freeing them up to vote for somebody else. Do these delegates have the legal right to switch their votes to another candidate? Well, generally yes, but there's little precedent for that, and state laws still come into play. The initial question is whether state elections supersedes a political party's rules. The Supreme Court decided this issue in a case called the Democratic Party of U.S. versus Wisconsin ex rel. La Follette. The Democratic Party Selection Rule 2A for the 1980 National Convention required delegates to be chosen by voters who were affiliated with the party. But Wisconsin law allowed non-Democrats to vote in an open primary and required that delegates selected under the system vote at the state party convention in accordance with the primary results. The Wisconsin Democratic Party selected its delegates in a caucus after the primary, but the National Democratic Party prohibited those delegates from participating in the 1980 convention because independents and Republicans voted in the primary and influenced the outcome. The Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld the state law, but the Supreme Court reversed that decision, finding that the political parties enjoy protection from undue state intrusions into their associational rights. The state argued that it had a compelling interest in state elections, including, quote, preserving the overall integrity of the electoral process, providing secrecy of the ballot, increasing voter participation in primaries, and preventing harassment of voters. But the Supreme Court ruled that all of those interests go to the conduct of the presidential preference primary, not to the imposition of voting requirements upon those who, in a separate process, are eventually selected as delegates. Therefore, the interests advanced by the state do not justify its substantial intrusion into the associational freedom of members of the national party. Now, states still have the right to regulate the way that political parties select their candidates. If you're interested in the limits of state power over elections, you can see my video about the Supreme Court's ruling that states could not ban Trump from primary ballots because he violated state law by participating in an insurrection. So the La Follette decision would seem to mean that a political party's rules mostly supersedes state law. But many states still have provisions impacting national party conventions. For example, Florida state law stipulates that, quote, any party rule directing the vote of delegates at a national nominating convention shall reasonably reflect the results of the presidential preference primary if one is held. Now, Biden won the Florida primary, and Florida law is silent on what happens when a candidate withdraws or releases their delegates. Presumably, that means that Florida delegates would follow the rules of the National Democratic Party, but it could be a mess. We can game it out. If Harris was nominated instead of Biden, that would arguably reasonably reflect the results since she was on the ballot as vice president. But if someone wanted to contest the meaning of shall reasonably reflect the results of the primary, there's always the possibility of litigation. And don't forget about Dean Phillips, who came in second in the Democratic primary. The Phillips campaign went nowhere despite making Biden's age his main talking point, but he might argue that he should be next in line for the nomination. But of course, the problem for him is that there'd be no party rule that mandates that result. But what are the Democratic Party rules for the 2024 convention? Well, delegates are divided into two categories, pledged and unpledged. Pledged delegates have to vote for whichever candidate in their party wins the primary or caucus in their respective state, while unpledged delegates may choose to vote for any candidate. In the Democratic Party, unpledged delegates are known as superdelegates, current elected officials and party leaders who can support any candidate. Now, the overwhelming majority of Democratic delegates were elected back in their districts, and they tend to be local activists and volunteers. Quote, in 2024, there are an estimated 4,672 delegates, 3,933 pledged delegates, and 739 superdelegates. Now, back in 2018, the DNC voted to ban superdelegates from voting on the first ballot at a contested national convention. The nominee needs 1,976 delegates to confirm the nomination. Biden won about 3,900 delegates during the primary, and if Biden releases his delegates because he's withdrawing from the race, then DNC bylaws generally give the DNC the responsibility of filling vacancies in the nomination for the office of president and vice president. Under Article 2, Section 8F of the bylaws, voting to fill a vacancy on the national ticket shall be in accord with the procedural rules adopted by the Rules and Bylaws Committee and approved by the Democratic National Committee. But what if Biden hadn't dropped out of the race? Could pledged delegates have gone rogue and voted for somebody else? The 2024 delegate selection rules state that, quote, no delegate at any level of the delegate selection process shall be mandated by law or party rule to vote contrary to that person's presidential choice as expressed at the time the delegate is elected. However, Rule 13J of the delegate selection rules seems to give pledged delegates the ability to vote for somebody else. Quote, delegates elected to the national convention pledged to a presidential candidate shall in all good conscience reflect the sentiments of those who elected them. Now, we don't know what constitutes in all good conscience. It's never been tested before since these rules have only been in place since 1984. But a delegate could argue that the sentiments of voters in their state have changed and that they no longer want Biden as the nominee. But pledged delegates are probably locked in and can't vote for somebody else unless Biden releases them. But there's also no law that would prohibit the DNC from changing the rules before or during the convention. But you can bet that the Republican Party could and probably would file legal challenges of any effort to replace Biden at the convention, though they probably wouldn't have the best arguments. If Biden withdraws and or releases his delegates and the party nominates somebody else, Republicans might not have standing to challenge that process. Of course, that doesn't mean they wouldn't try. Now, obviously, if you're suing to stay on a presidential ballot, you'll want some good election lawyers. But if you want a great lawyer, my law firm, the Eagle Team, can help. If you've suffered a data breach, especially if you got a data breach letter saying that your social security number was leaked and you're like, why do you even still have my social security number? Or if you were involved in a car crash or dealing with mesothelioma, we can represent you or help find you the right attorney who can. It's so important to talk to a lawyer right away so you can maximize your recovery and find out what your options are. So just click on the link in the description or call the number that's on screen for a free consultation with my team. Because you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle Team. Though things are even more complicated thanks to Ohio. The meme is definitely true. Ohio is absolutely the worst. Ohio has a state law that says, quote, a political party certifying candidates so nominated shall certify the names of those candidates to the Secretary of State on or before the 90th day before the day of the general election. The 90-day requirement means that the deadline for ballot certification is August 7th, which is 2 weeks before the DNC convenes in Chicago. This provision has caused problems before. In both 2012 and 2020, both Democratic and Republican conventions were held after the 90-day headline, and the legislature extended the deadline on both occasions. But this time it's different. Republicans were angry that some states tried to kick Trump off the ballot, for insurrection. So Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose, who was in the midst of a primary for U.S. Senate, refused to accept provisional certification. The Republican-dominated Ohio legislature talked tough about not extending the deadline, but LaRose eventually lost his primary to car salesman and Uber Trumper Bernie Moreno, and the legislature continued to take its time. And instead of filing a lawsuit, the DNC decided it will hold a virtual roll call nominating Biden-Harris in time for the 90-day deadline before the official convention. Now, this seems to be technically unnecessary because Ohio enacted a law extending the deadline, but Democratic officials smell a rat. DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee co-chair Minion Moore, who is the chair of the convention, said that they couldn't trust the Ohio legislature, which has proven to be, quote, untrustworthy stewards of voting rights. Moore believes that the state might pull a fast one and undo their law to screw Biden over at the last minute. Quote, she noted that the law delaying the deadline doesn't go into effect until August 31st. But the DNC confirmed that the virtual roll call would happen, but not before August 1st. When this decision was made, there was no significant movement to get Biden to drop out. So in addition to all the backroom discussions of Biden's mental fitness, the Democrats are juggling the Ohio situation and the virtual roll call, which is not great.
It would have been a mess if Biden had dropped out after the deadline.
But what would have happened if Biden had been formally nominated at the convention, but withdrew, died, or became incapacitated sometime thereafter? Well, this has sort of happened once before in modern times. In 1972, vice presidential nominee Thomas Eagleton withdrew from the ticket after reports that he'd been hospitalized due to his mental health. This is why Pawnee is better than Eagleton.
When I say that people from Eagleton are snobby and evil, and they look down on Pawnee, and they would most likely exterminate everyone who isn't from Eagleton if they weren't so busy being obsessed with themselves.
But the Democratic National Committee met and appointed a new candidate for vice president, Sergeant Shriver. The same process would be in play if Biden withdraws after the convention. The DNC has 453 members, and they all are empowered to fill vacancies, as I discussed earlier. Now, the rules don't require the DNC to pick the vice presidential nominee, but it's highly likely that they would pick Kamala Harris to replace Biden. But the Heritage Foundation, fresh off of its launch of Project 2025, announced it would challenge efforts to replace Biden in 3 swing states, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Nevada. The main legal hurdle for the Heritage Foundation and other Republican-aligned groups is that they need to demonstrate standing. So you can bet the Democratic Party would argue that it alone has the power to nominate its presidential candidate, and that no outsider has standing to challenge that. But there would be another obstacle to replacing Biden after the convention: the state ballot deadlines. The Democratic National Convention isn't until late August, which would make for some tight deadlines if they were to replace Biden after the convention. And while the Heritage Foundation is already spreading misinformation about ballot deadlines, alleging that in some states like Wisconsin the deadlines have already passed, that's not true. A memo from the Wisconsin Elections Commission confirmed that the deadline for certification would be Tuesday, September 3rd, 2024. So if Biden dropped out after the convention, the National Party will still have time to name a different candidate for the Wisconsin ballot. But the Heritage Foundation also asserts that Wisconsin can't replace Biden unless he dies. State law says, quote, if a vacancy occurs after nomination due to the death of a candidate of a recognized political party for partisan office, the vacancy may be filled by the chairperson of the committee of the proper political party under the section. Now, these provisions allow the party to replace Biden if he dies, but you can bet that there would be litigation over whether the fact that it specifies if the candidate dies means only if the candidate dies. Now, states like Nevada have similar laws, but all of this is state dependent, and there are 50 different states, and I'm not going to go through every single state's laws.
The bottom line is that the Republicans will fight a new candidate in every state they can. It will be litigation Thunderdome.
And the other big question on everyone's mind is, what happens to the money? If Biden is not the Democratic nominee for president, what happens to all of his campaign funds? As of June, Democratic groups, including the Biden campaign, the DNC, state Democratic parties, and other groups, had about $240 million of cash on hand. And money that Biden-Harris raised for the DNC would still be able to be transferred to the new nominee. But things get more complicated for the funds held by the Biden-Harris campaign committee. As of May 30th, the campaign itself had about $91 million. This money was officially raised by the Biden-Harris ticket, and it legally belongs to the campaign. So if Harris became the nominee for president, she would probably inherit that $91 million. She is, of course, still on the ticket. In the event that Harris is not the nominee, well, then that money obviously could be refunded to donors, but also the Biden-Harris campaign could transfer that $91 million to a federal super PAC, which could then spend its advertising on the new ticket. But it wouldn't be able to be used directly by the candidate itself. Though the lines between candidates and super PACs are certainly blurring these days. Now, a super PAC is a type of political committee that is permitted to raise and spend soft money, but only so long as the super PAC does not contribute to federal candidates directly, who are subject to FICA limits. This prohibition on super PAC contributions to candidates extends to coordinated communications, which are a type of coordinated expenditure that qualifies as an in-kind contribution under FICA. Candidates may not knowingly accept excessive or otherwise prohibited contributions from super PACs. So if the money is transferred to a super PAC, then the campaign won't be able to coordinate how the federal super PAC spends that money. But a super PAC called Future Forward is testing the limits of its influence. The New York Times reported that Future Forward is withholding $90 million if Biden stayed in the race. Now, obviously, the Biden campaign couldn't coordinate with Future Forward, but if they withheld funds, then it means that that money wouldn't have gone to the benefit of the Biden campaign in general. But it's likely Joe Biden would have the ultimate authority to decide where the money goes. Now, some candidates have found ways to circumvent the FEC. When Michael Bloomberg briefly ran for president in 2020, his campaign was mostly self-funded. When he dropped out, he transferred $18 million from his campaign to the DNC. That $18 million is well over individual contribution amounts, but the FEC allowed it because it came from a campaign, albeit one funded almost entirely from the candidate's own money. And a new candidate for president would need to raise a whole bunch of money very fast. But the bottom line is that things would be relatively straightforward if Kamala Harris was the nominee, and things would be awfully messy if it's anyone else. So if Biden drops out, we're all going to need a whole bunch of coffee for the next 3 months, which we can get from today's sponsor, Trade Coffee. Trade Coffee is a specialty coffee marketplace that matches customers with the best coffees from local roasters across the country. It's the best way to experience small batch specialty coffees and support small businesses. The coffee is roasted to order and ships to you within 48 hours. Now, I don't know about where you live, but in DC right now, it is incredibly hot and incredibly humid, and it's the perfect time to drink my coffee ice cold. And lately, I've been enjoying this coffee from Trade called Cold Front. It's made specifically for cold brewing, and it's delicious. In fact, I was supposed to film this sponsorship with a full bag, but not full anymore. And Trade has a new coffee subscription, which allows a rotating variety of the best iced and cold brew coffees to make at home, curated by their team of coffee experts. It's a great option to cool off the summers and stay caffeinated all year long. And with Trade, you can get great coffee every week or gift a coffee subscription to a friend or loved one. All you have to do is choose how often you want to receive your beans, and they can personalize the rest. Now, I have very specific tastes in coffee. Basically, I want something that tastes like hot chocolate and pairs well with milk. And Trade was able to find me the perfect bean. And you claim you want a tea-like natural process light roast, but really you want a dark roast that tastes like chocolate and you can load up with half and half. But either way, Trade has you covered. Because if you already know what you like, then they probably already have your roaster in stock at a great price. And you can choose whole beans or your preferred grind, and your coffee is roasted to order, so it's coming to you really fresh. Way fresher than some of the supermarket coffee that's been sitting on the shelf for a week. So from hot or iced, dark roast to decafs or espresso to cold brew, Trade has it all. And of course, coffee from Trade makes a great gift, and you can't go wrong with good coffee. Trade is so confident that you'll love your experience, they're offering 30% off your first order. All you have to do is click on the link in the description, the one that's on screen right now. It's a great opportunity to spice up your morning routine and try some delicious coffee. So get 30% off your first order by clicking on the link below. And after that, click on this link over here for more Legal Eagle, or I'll see you in court.